authority. It makes the Bible. It's been changed in translations over the years. So all those questions about the Bible get put to rest. Now we're going to switch for the second part of the fall into a time about relationships and conflict, because we have two leading experts on that topic. And so this comes up a lot in Christian circles, questions about relationships, whether you want to get into one, you want to get out of one, or stay in one, help it become healthy again. And so this will be a really good section. And I want you to be active listeners and bring questions for Matt and Josh. And one of the main things we'll focus on is the way conflict works between people. In general, Christians, but also within marriage. How conflicts come up, how they can be resolved in a healthy manner. Because Christians of all people should be known for the love they have in marriage. That should be something that we're known for, we excel at. And that's particularly charged for husbands. Love your wives. And a wife should be able to say honestly, yeah, my husband really loves me. He shows that all the time. But sometimes in our sin and also in our not really knowing how to do that, husbands don't really do a good job of loving their wives. And they need to learn how to do that. And so I think we're going to be really happy about this advice you guys get. And you don't need me up here anymore. You need these guys. Come on down.
We decided to get away from this little pulpit thing and try to match our heights. I just figured I'd call it out before you did. I could go on a shorter one if you guys want.
No. I think Owen, you need a new definition for leading experts.
Yeah, that might be the case.
So you said sell yourself short.
I heard that. I know, my wife even sent me a thing. Leading experts. No, she said it in a complimentary way. She wasn't laughing about it.
In the group of Reformed Christian, just kidding, communication experts.
Yeah, I mean, Josh and I have been teaching this kind of stuff a long time, in case you're wondering. And we're just going to bring a lot of that. So there are a lot of things, topics that I'm just going to outline for. We didn't print this off. We will at some point. But it's just an outline of topics, because the three of us, we wanted to talk about some of these more and like get them down. So they might change a little bit. What are you laughing about?
I just feel like we're kind of like a folk singing group up here.
Yeah, we are.
Like
There's a folk singing group.
It's like a mighty wind.
I don't know why that's the only banjo song in my head is that one. So first we're going to talk about attachment styles and conflict styles today. And then we'll get into some other things. I don't know the order yet since we haven't figured that out yet. But things like emotions, and because no one messaged us about this, we just came up with this list. Like gridlock and destructive aspects of conflict, goal setting in families, personal goals, understanding communicative goals as you're talking about them, intimacy as well, communicative styles between men and women. And then there's various other topics that actually some people message us about this topic is submission. And then by some persons, my hand is waving towards that person right now. Like what that means. And I was asking Owen about this, and just briefly, before we get into it, that'd be weeks from now, that they said, yeah, if there's anything you guys ever want to talk to the elders about, they're open to talking to you guys about anything. So, but I know there might be some leeriness of like, I don't want to bug them or get my husband in trouble or get my wife in trouble. But yeah, it's always good to check in with them. Having friends is a topic, joyfulness in yourself, in marriage. I put forgiveness, I put money. I don't know if we'll talk about money, but forgiveness is a good topic to talk about. And we'll talk about various tools as well as we go through this. So today, we just want to talk about styles, patterns. You might not notice this. Maybe you do if you're like metacognitive, that you recognize that you have a pretty set pattern of how you do conflicts. But I bet your spouse sees it. It's like, hey, every time I bring something up to them, they act in a pretty predictable way. But if they don't, this might help you guys figure that out and seeing that way. And then a lot of it, what Josh will start with, and then I'll get into the styles a little bit, is attachment, because that's another piece of styles. Josh also posted on Band, a great tool under the bulletin today. So I would check out that tool. It's like a How We Love tool. And I think there's an attachment styles quiz on there. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, all right, let's get into some of these. Patterns. Attachment styles. Josh, tell us about attachment styles.
So one of the things that I've just been impressed by, or it's been impressed upon me, is this idea that our conflicts, whether they're in our friendships, even in our teen years, or our romantic relationships, our conflicts in our current relationships start in childhood, is the phrase. And the reference that I put onto Band is the two people are Milan and Kay Yerkovich, and they wrote this book called How We Love. And the How We Love book is connected with attachment research, and so attachment styles are just about this idea of many of you already know, I think, who have studied psychology and so forth, are from John Bowlby in the 60s and 70s, and he did these research studies with still face mothers.
Don't watch it. It's weird.
It is actually pretty upsetting. You can look up like 2-minute ones on YouTube where a mom basically who is otherwise, caring and affectionate kind of turns away from her baby and then turns back and is just still faced. And you can see how the baby kind of reacts in discomfort and then kind of looks around and then screams and cries. And the idea there is that, especially in the early developmental stages, we need comfort, we need security, and that comes from our intimate, our close caregivers. And the way that our caregivers do bring comfort or don't bring comfort has an imprint on the way that we seek out that comfort later on in life. And so it's just one aspect of making sense of the ways we connect. So there are different styles. So Bowlby, again, has that research and has certain kind of like anxious attachment or ambivalent attachment or reactive attachment, those kinds of things. But I like the Yerkoviches, How We Love, their styles that they address. And the styles that they address are secure attachment, avoidant attachment, avoiders, pleasers, vacillators, controllers, and victims. And also,
Could you use that again?
Yeah,
I can write it down.
yeah,
They're writing it down.
absolutely. So
see
there's
David's doing it.
avoiders, pleasers, vacillators, which is VACILLATORS, vacillators, like a spelling bee. Vacillator.
Can you use that in a sentence?
My what? No, just kidding. That was a good one. Vacillators, controllers, and victims. And again, they're all surrounding this idea of how did you learn to give and receive comfort. And so one of the questions that the Yerkoviches ask couples, when they do like couples counseling and stuff like that, is they ask them, can you think, and I'm going to ask you this, can you think of 3 times in your childhood where you received comfort from your caregivers? Just think about that, like write that down. How did I receive comfort?
We should say something while you guys are doing that about styles and patterns. Is they can be hard to to like an untrained eye feel like they're astrology symbols. Where you're like, I fit into all of them. Because you might at certain times fit into different ones. But it's important just to note a predominant pattern that you have is one or the other. But also, just as another word of caution, not getting stuck into, as this is kind of like a day on background stuff, not getting stuck into, I'm an avoider, so I'm stuck always being an avoider. And doing what some people in personality research do is they then justify their behaviors based on some type. You can change things over time. You can grow, you can mature. But it's just helpful to note, like, okay, this is actually my go-to, and it's pretty ingrained in me that I do this quite often. There's some strengths and weaknesses for each of them. And there is always, there's not like, there's a couple combos that are really terrible. But you can pretty much work on your combo and yourself and stuff like that. So don't get caught into that kind of truncated thinking of, like, I'm an avoider, therefore all my relationships, I'll never settle my conflicts. No, you can grow out of these things. There's actually some research on attachment that'll indicate that you can be an avoider for various reasons, and you can become more secure in your attachment over time. But it takes work. It's not like it just happens. You're just like, I want to be secure, because your go-to mentality is very insecure.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess in that sense, it's like anything else where you could over-identify with something and just kind of use that as an excuse not to change. And obviously, we don't want to do that. So, yeah, something to think about. It's also, too, it can be used on the flip side, too, right? You're such an avoider. See, you always do that. You're an avoider. And so obviously that could be something that's damaging. It also could be, too, one of the things that I tell clients that I work with is that I'm not out to make villains or victims when we talk about parents. Like in our upbringing, right, like I had a supportive family, right? And my parents loved me and they took care of me. They raised me in the Lord as best they knew how. And I also learned some patterns that I've taken in certain ways that make things challenging in my marriage and otherwise. So it's not thinking about, it's sometimes, especially in the counseling world, there can be a sensitivity to like, oh yeah, if people come in, let's just blame the parents and then we'll feel better. And it's not quite that. You can understand certain ways that you got a certain kind of imprint from the way that you observed things and perceived things in your childhood. So that's another way to look at it. Is that it's not a victim mentality too. That kind of relates to the change idea. So conflicts in our current relationships, I think it's important to see that they're triggered in our current relationships, and we're living out how we know to connect in our current relationships, but that's not where the cause of those patterns are. So we do need to look into the roots in our past. And one of the questions to think about is that idea of comfort. How have I received comfort? How have I learned to give comfort? Okay. And so I'm just going to go through briefly and kind of talk about each of the styles. Again, very briefly. The goal and what I put on band is the goal is to be better at giving and receiving comfort. So the tool that isn't really helpful if we don't understand our kind of patterns that we're in, because we will be triggered and we won't want to use any kind of tool. The tool is called the comfort circle. So the link I put to the freebies section has this video of this couple going through the comfort circle. And so you can see it's kind of a guide for a listener in particular to interview, and the goal is to understand a lot more of why someone feels the way they do. The question they ask the couple is, what most bothers you about your spouse? What most bothers you about your spouse? And so it's an opportunity really for the listener to understand much more deeply what bothers you about me, without me saying anything in response. Like I'm just asking questions to understand more and more about why it bothers you, what effect it has on you, what then happens to you as you react, and where have you already experienced these kinds of reactions in your childhood. So that's the idea. Yes, we can post these on band. I just got distracted. Okay. Where to go?
There's also, as Josh is pulling it up, there's a lot. Oh, okay, never mind. I was going to add something else. I'll add it later.
So, briefly, the avoider. Here's the avoider. I like people, but I'm not very comfortable when they get emotional or needy around me. I like to keep it simple. It's so much easier when people just take care of themselves like I do. So, kind of the self-reliant person, right? Independent, not really keen on emotional awareness for themselves or others. They're kind of like, I'm fine. Everything's fine. We're good. Just do your thing and I'll do my thing and we'll be okay. Something to kind of note in there is that avoiders tend to believe that they can get the comfort they need, but others can't give it. There's something about others that they just don't trust other people to be able to give that. And so often avoiders are the ones that struggle with kind of substance or process addictions because that's the way that they get comfort.
Yeah, you might summarize this also as like a pessimistic mentality. Is you just have pessimism. You can't settle a dispute. you can't connect, you can't deal with anything, and so just don't do it.
Yeah. So if avoiders are the ones that are like, emotions aren't really helpful, I'm self-reliant, I'm independent, practical, I don't really have a high value on the need for emotional disclosure, awareness, that kind of stuff. The pleasers can sometimes be confused with avoiders. The pleaser is this: I enjoy caring for others and work hard at making those I love happy. I'm not great at saying no or keeping boundaries, but anything is better than having people upset with me. So whereas avoiders don't really want to have a whole lot to do with emotions in general, pleasers don't want to have anything to do with negative emotions. There's a very low bandwidth for negative emotions, and so pleasers tend to be pretty intuitive people and are always reading the emotions of others around me. And if they don't seem like they're good, all of my communication energy in the relationship is to try to exert that influence to raise the level to the more positive emotions.
Yeah.
Okay.
This can be, we'll talk about it later, but this can be problematic in a family when you both please and don't deal with the negative emotions of your kids or each other.
Yeah. Vacillators. The vacillator is, I long for close connection in relationships, but people always let me down. I spend a lot of time in my head trying to process all the disappointments, and I wonder why relationships are so hard. So in particular, the vacillator can be a kind of idealist, a romantic idealist. And vacillators in this research come from families where there's someone who's either highly critical or highly anxious, where the comfort is more about the parent needing comfort and not the child. So often children become that kind of caretaker, and the roles are flipped, which can be pretty problematic for children as they're developing. And the vacillator is the one that's always kind of waiting for that moment, like, when is this parent going to be here for me? But then when the time comes and the parent's finally ready, the child's kind of angry and distant. So that's the whole idea of vacillating is like a seesaw, right? It's an up and down, and so it's a little bit more reactive. And so that's where, like, vacillators can tend to make people feel like they're walking on eggshells around them, because their inner reactivity is tough for them. And they tend to dwell on the more negative aspects of relationships because of the idealism. Controller, I don't like being outside of my comfort zone, so I always make sure I'm the one in charge. That way I know for sure that I won't be taken advantage of. So the controller and victim are ones that usually find each other, and they're usually the ones that are coming from much more traumatic childhoods, typically. The controller, the way that I see the controller, is kind of like the person who experiences a lot of pain growing up and not a lot of comfort at all. And then they basically take on this strategy, like, I'm going to get so hard, I'm going to get so strong, I'm going to get so tough that I won't ever be in a position to be hurt again. So, like, I had one situation.
Gone with the wind.
Yeah, gone with the wind. Yeah, I had actually many situations where the clients I work with are like men who are huge. They're like really muscular. And one was like in prison, and the mom dropped him off and never came to visit him after that. And he pretty intentionally said, I got huge in prison because I was never going to be the one that was hurt again. I was going to be the enforcer. That was the idea. And so the controller is like that, is being so daunting and so overwhelming that they'll never be a victim again. The victim, on the other hand, is this: I keep my needs quiet, and honestly, I'm not even sure what my needs are. It's safer when I just go with the flow. There's less opportunity for blow up. So sometimes it can be confused with the pleaser, because the pleaser's doing something similar, managing other people's moods. But the victim, I see the victim as, the Homer Simpson gif where he's just kind of stepping back into the bushes, right? I see the victim more like that. The victim's just trying to be a wallflower. So that they're just not noticed. Again, from a highly reactive, traumatic upbringing, typically. But instead of the controller, which is trying to be a force to be reckoned with, right, so that they're never hurt again, the victim just tries to be absent, tries to be just invisible to others. So the reason why these things are important is because they're about noticing imprints. Noticing patterns that we've learned, and it's focused on comfort, right? Like, we talk a lot about meaning and the need for meaning, and I think that those are fundamentally intertwined, right? The way we receive comfort is deeply connected with what we find meaningful in relationships. And so the whole point in these love styles, I think, is just to notice how have I learned, especially indirectly, to give and receive that comfort, to give and receive that meaning, and what happens when I don't get that, right? What happens when there's another style? And the interesting thing about this, and maybe I'll just pass it back over to Matt after this, is there's core patterns to these, like on the website, you can see that there's like a vacillator avoider pattern. And so often, the interesting thing about it is that vacillators, for example, are really attracted to avoiders because avoiders on the outside seem to be very consistent. And so vacillators are longing for that consistency in relationships in general. And so they see that consistency in avoider because an avoider is like, I'm going to be independent and self-reliant, right? I'm not even going to touch emotions. And then the vacillator is like, ooh, that's very attractive. But then that complementarity, right, becomes tricky the more you get into conflicts in your relationship. So there's these things called core patterns, and they're basically just typical patterns of conflict that are pretty predictable. They're predictable because they hinge on this idea of how you try to give and receive comfort. And for example, if a vacillator is focusing on the negative aspects of a relationship and an avoider is just kind of off on their own, the vacillator's tension builds, the vacillator goes toward the avoider, and the avoider is like, whoa, that's a lot of emotion, red flag, right? And then avoids more, and the vacillator, so you can see how these patterns start. And the Yurkoviches give kind of off-ramps, right? The general tool for the off-ramp is the comfort circle, but they give certain kinds of homework assignments, like homework for the vacillator and homework for the avoider, because there are off-ramps to notice when you do get triggered. So again, conflicts in our current relationships start in childhood. Usually they're because we have deep longings for connection, meaning, and comfort, and we just have wrong strategies. We have the wrong strategies for doing that. And wrong in the sense that they conflict with and are usually mindless about what works for the other person, or really sometimes what works for yourself. So that's kind of just an introduction to the love styles.
Yeah. Any questions you guys have on
what
this?
questions?
Before I jump into something else that's related to this about backgrounds.
I should say,
Yeah.
Will asked a question about kind of tools and when tools work or don't work. I think it's really important to notice that, like, when we're in conflicts with our partners, a lot of the stuff that we're reacting to, it's not that it's non-rational. It is rational in the sense that we have concepts in our mind, but it's definitely when the part of our brain that's more of like the prefrontal cortex, right, the rational processing center, is kind of shut down. Like, we literally feel that the attack of the other person relationally is a threat to our integrity. And we don't really make the distinction between like physical integrity, like my jujitsu defense kind of integrity versus emotional integrity. Our brain doesn't really recognize that difference. And so that part of our brain shuts down, and the things that we processed in kind of the more emotional part of our brain is really taking over. And so that's another thing too, like when people say, we just can't use the comfort circle because I get so mad, I get so flooded with the emotions, the anxiety or the anger. I think that's super important to recognize because that's an indicator that there's things that I'm usually not aware of, messages about myself, messages about connection, messages about the other person that I'm not really rationally processing or processing on a very clear awareness level. And so it's important to kind of have times to dig into, what's that every time I get in a fight with Mindy, what's the thing that keeps coming out about myself? Like, I just have this negative cognition that, let's say, for example, I'm alone. That is a common one that I hear from couples. Like, one person, when they're triggered by another, there's kind of like this deep feeling of, I'm alone and you're not with me. That's not mine. But for some people that is, I'm alone. Mm-hmm. Or for guys, it might be, I'm a failure. And it's like, I didn't say you were a failure, but there's something about the interaction that made me, in my emotional brain, make that up as a reality I'm feeling. And so that's an important part of the language of the How We Love tool, is noticing there's stuff going on that has a language, but we're usually not attuned to using that language or noticing those beliefs that we're operating out of.
Adam asked a good question.
Where?
He texted
How?
it to me.
Okay, nice. Nice.
Where? How? He texted it to me. He said, "Can you be combos of these things?"
Oh yeah. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
I didn't see your hand.
One of the things that the Yurkoviches, great question, Adam. One of the things that the Yurkoviches talk about is that the context usually determines that. And so, like for example, they help couples mostly, and so they usually tell people, even if you have kind of a mix of some, like notice the one that's more prominent in your marriage relationship, because that's what we're helping you with. So like in marriage, I'm more of an avoider. I've noticed at work, I'm more of a vacillator. And we were just talking about this, like, do you mind me sharing? Like Mindy's a vacillator, and it made me realize, we can actually connect a lot, because even though I'm not a vacillator in our relationship, in work I am. And so it's given us a little bit more of a common ground. Like, it's not you're alien to me. It's, in this context, I actually kind of have similar feelings. I just don't have that same reaction in our relationship. So I would just focus on the prominent style in the context that you're trying to work better.
So to kind of summarize, we're thinking about a lot of ways that you get the other person triggers you into some bad pattern that you're used to, often because you fear or you don't find comfort in something that the other person, that you see the other person having, and then because they're going off on something, you're like, well, I just better run away from this because it's not safe. And that's something pattern that you learned in adolescence and childhood. There's another good model to think about, especially you parents, but everyone has this because you've all been kids at one point, that when we talk about trauma, Josh mentioned a couple like acute forms of trauma, like intense forms of trauma, but there's also ones that are like just more mundane that might lead into your conflicts, that are like your parents didn't empower you, or they falsely empowered you. Some parents have done this to their kids, like, you're my best friend. No, that's not really appropriate. Like, the kid can't be your best friend. Or they've called their kid idiots, or they've called them various names with falsely empower them. It's like, and then they had to carry this around in their cognition. Or they were intrusive, too intrusive to their kids, or they were just sort of not engaged and avoidant, what would the word be, kind of abandoning the kids, whether it's in small ways, like emotionally, or you try to intrude too much in the kid's life. So these little patterns can kind of happen outside of like a nice comfort thing, because to be honest, healthy couples do intrude a little bit. They do empower each other a little bit. They do disempower each other when it's appropriate, and they do abandon each other when it's appropriate. Of like, no, that's on you. But going a little outside of that is kind of a normal, what we might call like more moderate sorts of traumas that lead into bad patterns later in your life, when your marriage, whether it's work, marriage, friendships, and you might change your style according to different friendships, according to different contexts. I mean, you can take that one, and what I would encourage you guys to do with that, I think there's an inventory on there to take, is I always encourage my students to take an inventory, but then give it to somebody else or two other people in two different areas of life, that they take it for you to see how you behave in those areas of life, and for your own self, switch the contexts. Like, you might be very avoidant in your marriage, in your romantic relationship, but you might be very secure. We didn't talk about this one because it's like the healthy one. Secure at work, because that's where you find normality and security and a sense of self, but then you avoid your relationship, and so that'd be a bad pattern to get into. How this works out in couples, though, so we have 5 minutes to talk about this. So sometimes couples will end up both being avoiders, and you'll end up kind of, now here's, might be some recognitions for you if you're both avoiding things. When you just go to agree to disagree, and then you go into, instead of persuading each other in a conflict, you avoid persuading, you kind of have a negative connotation about that, and you just quickly go into like, well, here's good things we agree on and commonalities. You're like, that's great that you have commonalities, but you're avoiding now leaning into your conflict. And so this can happen a lot of times. It's not a healthy pattern, because what you end up doing is avoiding all the ways that you can connect further, which underlies this pessimistic attitude that you're like, there's nothing good that can come out of our conflicts, which is the opposite reality. Quite a lot of good things can come out of your conflicts if you know how to deal with them well. But going back to what Josh said, if you learn that at a young age that conflicts are bad, then relearning that conflicts are good is going to take a lot of time and a curiosity and graciousness by yourself, to your spouse as well. How some of these other couples work out is you can get kind of more volatile couples, which is fine if if you find yourselves being volatile and you kind of get really impassioned and loud. That's okay. There's many people around the world that do this. Just go to New York City, and that's what they do, right? They kind of yell, but importantly, they don't like kind of attack each other as person. But they might get really passionate. I can't believe that you don't care about this thing. And they go immediately to persuasive attempts rather than waiting to go to persuasive attempts. They go straight into trying to persuade each other, which is appropriate, which is fine. And they kind of think more about interdependentness, like that what your attitude and belief on something really matters for who I am and for who we are together. And so it escalates really quickly in their mind emotionally, which is fine. We'll talk about tools later in the subsequent weeks about how to get there. The important thing would be to kind of build empathy in those ways and understand each other. The third couple that the Gottmans, there's a lot of different models, but I just like the Gottmans one is simple, where you have the avoider, the volatile, and then the validating couples. The validating couples are kind of, if you think of it in the spectrum of avoiders to volatiles, the validators can kind of more be in the middle, where in your conflict, you're probably you're not going straight into persuasive attempts or avoiding persuasive attempts. You're first trying to understand each other. And so this has to be predominantly like a sense of curiosity. But like, I'm really curious why you just reacted like that, Ben. And so you start building cognitive empathy with the person, trying to understand them, and then you try to persuade them. After all of that, you're like, okay, now that I understand you, you're wrong, but but what you're doing is you're postponing the persuasion till later. All of these can work, okay, wherever you find yourself, but that's a pretty simple model to think about your relationship you're in. Are we both avoiding stuff and we predominantly go towards saying, look at all the stuff we agree on, isn't it so wonderful? When something comes up, you're like, yeah, you guys are avoiding a conflict. Or validating and affirming each other's views and then getting persuasion. Or as soon as something comes up, you get straight in persuasion and it's really emotional and it's taxing in some way. It kind of feels like a law room or a courtroom, right? It's like you have the argument right away, and it's very passionate. Those can work. All these things can work. So I hope none of you here like, oh, if I'm avoiders, that can be a bad thing. There are some avoidant couples that work out okay. It just can be a very negative thing. And if you don't work on any of this to attach to each other, and to your kids, by the way, you should pay attention to how you do this to your kids. They're all over there, so I'm gesturing over there. Most of them are. And do you kind of invalidate, do you empower, disempower your kids? Do you intrude upon them? Or do you kind of abandon them in their emotions? So there's also some research that's really helpful to think about. And again, this whole day is kind of thinking about notice your patterns, notice your spousal patterns, notice your patterns in your childhood that inform you, and then how they affect you, because the way you guys deal with emotions in your household is also based on all of your patterns beforehand. Whether you disempower emotions and you shove them away, you typically see like a detached family do positive emotions only, and they don't deal with negative emotions. But you see a healthy family coach negative and positive emotions, and they don't feel threatened by their kids screaming and yelling and having a fit. You're like, okay, well, we got to teach this kid. We got to find out why he's angry, and then what's going on with his anger and how not to be angry. It's going to take a long time to coach them through that. But you see the disempowering family just be like, hey, we don't get angry, and just ignore any reason behind that, rather than kind of being curious. So what I want you to take away as we're kind of closing, just think about noticing, as Josh kind of said. I think Josh posted on his Instagram. If you're not following him on his Instagram, you should, on Leverage Counseling, just to plug it. He talked about this of just being curious. That's like the first step. You got to be curious about yourself, because you've not probably paid attention to yourself, and you're probably stuck where you thought you were really successful. For a lot of people, it's high school. You're like Uncle Rico, and you're stuck in high school, okay? And you thought, that's how relationships work. It's not how relationships work. You got to go back and retool yourself. Be curious about your spouse and your kids too, and your friends, right? And just notice you're going to change in different contexts, and that's fine. Like, and it just means there's probably some like wounded parts of you that need some work in those areas, right? If you're just like, I'm running away from all conflicts at work. All right, there's something going on there that you probably need to press into and figure out. Or with your spouse, or with your kids, because sometimes you do that with your children. You're like, I don't want to deal with that negative emotion for my kid, so I'm going to avoid my kid. And that doesn't help them. You know, it's kind of like you might have done that because your parents were too intrusive in your life, and so you do the opposite thing. You avoid your children. So, any final questions? Because we're kind of running low on time here. Out of time. Okay. All right, cool. Well, we'll see you guys in like 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes now. You're welcome.